were to ask you, why do you come to worship on Sunday morning? Now let's assume that someone is not me. Because I think if I were to ask you that, you may feel somewhat compelled to give me certain answers. But let's say someone asked you that question to whom you could be brutally honest with about reasons you come to worship. Now my guess is there'd be probably quite a few responses, quite a variety of reasons. I thought of some of those, see if you agree. Might be the response that I come to see people, to just be with people. Or I come because I'm supposed to come. That might be an answer that you give me if I ask you the question. Well, I'm supposed to be here, Pastor. Someone might respond, well, it's good for me. It's good for my children to be in worship. You might respond, I come to learn something in worship. You might respond by saying, I like to sing. I like to hear music and sing and hear singers. You might respond, I'm kind of curious what's going to happen on a given day at worship. Maybe what the preacher's going to preach about or what he's going to do that's a little crazy. You might be brutally honest and say, I like worship, but I really like the snacks after worship. You might respond, well, it's part of my routine. It's just part of my weekly routine. You might respond that I come because I get to see a variety of ages of people, not just people my own age, but a variety of ages. You might respond, I come because it feels good to come to worship. All of those reasons are good and valid. I would guess that if somebody were to ask us, we would respond with any number of those reasons, depending on who asked and depending on the day. All valid, all good. But all of them, all of those responses can actually be experienced in other places rather than worship. Think about it for a moment. Let's take, for example, a basketball game over at the high school. Do people come to see people? Sure. Do people come because they're supposed to? Well, of course, support the hometown team. Do people come because it's good for them and good for their children to be in that kind of environment and see the teamwork and the sports? Of course. Do people come to learn something? Probably. Do people come because they want to sing? Sing the national anthem at every game? Do people come because they're curious what's going to happen? Of course. Do people come for the snacks? I've had popcorn over there, it's pretty darn good. Do people come because it's part of a routine? I go to the games, of course. Do people come to see a variety of ages? Oh, you see a variety of ages at a basketball game. Do people come because it feels good to get in there and root and be a part of that experience? Of course. So the question is, well then why is it we come to worship when we can have those needs met in other places? And that's when, if we were really pushed to think about our answer as to why do we come to worship, most of us would say something like, in addition to the reasons that we've already said, which are perfectly valid, we'd say something like, I'm not sure quite how to define it, but I just know that something happens when I'm in worship. I just know that something happens differently here than the other places I go. Now we have to admit that that something doesn't happen every single time we're in worship. And it doesn't happen to every single person that's in worship. But because it has happened and because we have experienced it, we know it has the potential to happen in worship. In the sermon series that we begin today for 3 Sundays, I want to look at that something that happens in worship. And what I'm calling that something is the holy. I have a definition for what holy is. Jake, bring that up there. This is my definition. It's no one else's definition. It's just mine. Encountering and experiencing God in a way that moves us to say, yeah, God exists, and I feel God's presence right now. I want to talk about the holy, and I want to talk about it specifically in regards to worship. But before we talk about holy and worship, I want to set some ground rules. Some holy ground rules, okay? The first one is this. We have to admit, we people of faith, have to admit that the holy can be experienced anywhere at any time, not necessarily in worship. I've experienced, and you've experienced, the holy in nature, at a sunrise or a sunset, or a beautiful mountain retreat. We've experienced the holy in a family gathering around an important occasion. We've experienced the first time that we hold a child, our own child. It's a holy moment. We experience holy when we grieve and mourn the last breath of someone we love. All of those, plus many more wonderful places to experience the holy. That's the first thing we have to admit, first ground rule. Holy can happen anywhere. Secondly, we have to admit that the holy is not always experienced in every worship service by every person present. Don't we have to admit that we've been present at a service of Christian marriage, or a service of death and resurrection, or a Sunday morning worship service, or a Wednesday evening worship service, or a worship service somewhere where our most common thought was not, hello God, but, oh God, when will this end? Third ground rule. After having admitted that holy happens everywhere, can happen anywhere, and admitting that it doesn't always happen in every single worship service with every single person, nonetheless, we must claim the reality that there are no other places which by its very design, its purpose, its DNA, if you will have it, has the potential to put us in touch with the holy than the worship experience. Graham Standish, in his book that I'm reading now and I'm really enjoying, it is called In God's Presence. He says, what is paramount in a worship service is encountering and experiencing God in a way that transforms us, even if just a little bit. As little bit comment there refers to his opinion that really, although none of us would admit it, we really don't want to be transformed too much. Standish believes that's one of the reasons we're hesitant to change too much about the worship we're used to. You can tinker with it a bit, but don't change it too much, because that may mean that I'm going to have to change too much. We assume often that the way we have always worshipped will appeal to seekers and searchers and non-church people that are looking for an encounter with God. And yet, as I've shared with you many times, new music, new ways to worship open up possibilities not only for seekers and searchers, but actually for us long-time worshipers too. We may not be able to teach an old dog new tricks, but God is able to continually teach us new ways to experience the holy. Standish says that congregations which are passionate care deeply about restoring the holy to worship and offering it as an opportunity for people to experience it as often as possible. Again, not necessarily by every individual in every service, but as often as possible. Graham believes that a lot of congregations of all denominations these days are moving that way, to do the things in worship and to change the things necessary and to do that in worship that allows people, as the early Christians did, to experience in their worship the holy. And the early Christians did that continually. They transformed and changed their worship as they went along because they wanted more people to experience the holy. So the question that I, as your pastor and worship leader, must continually ask is, do people encounter the holy in worship at this church? Do you experience in this time of worship the holy? To encounter and experience God in a way that transforms you, even if just a little bit. But I have to tell you, whether the answer to those questions is yes or no, our task is the same. And it's a task that we all share, not just the worship leaders. And the task is to be intentionally passionate, to come intentionally passionate, to lead intentionally passionate in worship in a way that enables us and others to experience the holy as often as possible. How do we do that? How do we do that? How do we do that? Well, I want to suggest there's 3 specific intentional ways that help us with our task. And these are the 3 things we're going to look at over these 3 sermons of this series. We're going to look at the sacraments of the church and how they help do that. We're going to look at the deeper understanding of the meaning of Sabbath. And we're going to look at a more fuller understanding of a worship that connects us with the holy as being present on the mountains and in the valleys of our lives. Next Sunday, we're going to look at our deeper understanding of Sabbath. And this would have been a good day to do that, with the parking lot at the school being filled today, and the question, what does it mean to honor and make holy the Sabbath? But we'll save that for next week, and don't get me started on that. 2 Sundays from now, we will celebrate Dazzle Sunday. Jesus went to the mountain with his friends and was transformed. We'll understand better, hopefully, how the holy comes to us in the mountains and the valleys of our life. But today we turn to the sacraments. Just a few words about the sacraments today. Sacraments, of course, come from the word sacred, which means something specifically connected with God and God's Word or the Bible. I shared that with the children this morning, that those things that Jesus actually did and those things he talked about in the Bible that we carry on now are really extra special when it comes to offering us the opportunity to be in touch with the holy. They come directly from Jesus, and the sacraments are examples of that. Angela read this morning from Paul's words about the sacrament of communion. He says, I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you. So Paul understands that from the very first, that this is something that's coming from Jesus that gets handed down. It's not just something we do, it's something that connects us with Jesus in an extra special way. That's what it means to share in the sacrament. In Matthew, Angela read words this morning that describe the event of Jesus' baptism and words about that. Both of these events come directly from Jesus, and both have the potential to connect us with the holy, and both should be done as regularly as possible. Think about it for a moment. What other activity in our lives is set aside specifically to experience the holy? Sacraments are those things that are set aside to experience the holy. Think about communion for a minute. We're going to share in it in just a few moments. Those who are not familiar with the sacrament of communion may look upon it at best with some curiosity. They may look at it with some disgust. That we take a little piece of bread and a little cup of juice and we make so much out of it. It's just a little piece of bread and a little cup of grape juice. But I've experienced its power, and you've experienced its power. Maybe it's Sunday worship or Wednesday evening worship. I've experienced it at youth retreats when we've gathered in worship to share the sacrament. I've experienced it around a campfire at night as we've looked up into the stars and worshiped together and shared communion. I've had the fortune of experiencing it in cathedrals in England. I've had the experience of sharing communion with people who are pretty much like me and people who are very, very different from me. I've shared communion at the hospital bed, shared communion in the trenches of despair. Something happens with that little piece of bread and that little cup of juice that connects me and connects you to the holy. And God's presence is felt in a different way. Does it happen every time we share in communion? No. Sometimes our minds are far away from what we're doing. Does it happen frequently? I hope so. Does this act of communion have the potential to connect us with the divine? It absolutely does. John Wesley, the father of the Methodist movement, defended in his sermon entitled The Duty of Constant Communion. He says this, Jake, if you bring that up there. He says, every Christian should do this as often as he can because the benefits of doing it are so great to all that do it in obedience to him. The forgiveness of our past sins and the present strengthening and refreshing of our souls. Something happens beyond what we can fully explain or understand. And in our world today of scientific and technological definitions and our demand to know everything about everything, isn't it truly refreshing that there is an activity in which we can engage that refreshes our souls, cleanses our souls, that strengthens us? Likewise, the sacrament of baptism offers an opportunity to recognize the non-earned, unconditional, grace-filled love of God for all of God's creation. Think about baptism for a moment. Those who are not familiar with the sacrament might look upon us at best with curiosity or at worst with disgust that we take a little baby and we parade it around up here and splash water on its head. And we make such a big deal about it. But I've experienced its power. Haven't you? Last week when I had Liam up here, and I put water on his head and he fell asleep, and you looked in that face, and for that moment, we were able to look just like God looked down upon Jesus when he was baptized and said, "This is my beloved son. This is my beloved daughter. This is my beloved creation." Think about it. Where else do we have the opportunity to take a small child and say, this is God's creation, and God said it's good. And to give that child that start as they journey through life where they're going to be judged and they're going to be in competition and all of the things are going to happen, we have that moment to claim what God says is good and is created by God. That's a holy moment. That's a holy occasion. Now, if you're curious, specifically about what United Methodists think about baptism and communion, there's a couple of great brochures, and they're right by the door. I don't know if how many of you have ever seen these or even know that they're there. They're wonderful explanations of a United Methodist approach to baptism and communion, and they're available, and feel free to pick one of those up. I want to conclude today by sharing a word about the series title that I'm sharing these 3 Sundays. A while ago, many years ago actually, we began seeing the phrase around, often on bumper stickers, sometimes other places, and the phrase was, "Stuff happens." Now, I've changed a word in that, haven't I? You know what the word is that I changed. I'm a bold pastor, but I'm not ready to say that in preaching this morning. You remember it. Stuff happens. And stuff does happen. Sometimes that stuff is awful. Sometimes it's stuff from which the grief or the pain or the fear or the complexity of it engulfs us and suffocates us. This has been a week when stuff happens. We've lost the father of 4 children. Tragic accident. We've lost another member of the community, a part of this church. Stuff happens, and sometimes it is tough stuff. But holy happens too. And holy is what helps us through all the other stuff. And sometimes holy happens accidentally. We're just somewhere, somehow, and it just happens. And we think, yeah, God exists. God is with me. God's going to be with me. But we, as people of faith, also have the opportunity to be intentional about inviting that holy to happen. That's why we come to worship. That's why worship is different from anything else we come to. It has the potential to be the channel or the roadway for the holy to get in touch with us and to transform our lives, even if just a little bit, and to get us through the stuff that happens. Stuff happens, but so does holy. Would you pray with me?